Hi, my name is Danica, and today I wanted to talk about my top 10 books of 2016. I know this is a late video, and I have excuses that I was sick and I'm moving and blah blah blah. But really, my best of 2015 video was like 4 months late, so this is a huge improvement. I have almost none of them in my possession. I only have one of these 10 because most of them I got through the library. Most of them I want to buy, but I haven't yet. So starting off at number 10, I have Kim and Kim Volume 1, which is a graphic novel. And this is an amazing comic about two bounty hunters. One of them is trans, both of them are queer, I'm pretty sure. And it's just this punk sci-fi comic with great diverse characters. And it's super fun. I really loved the style of it, the writing, the jokes. It actually had a foreword by Imogen Binnie, who wrote Nevada, which I also love. So if you liked her style, you would probably like this comic. Definitely highly recommended. For number 9, I have another graphic novel. This is a graphic novel anthology called Chainmail Bikini, and it's edited by Hazel Newlevant. This is a collection of comics that are about women gamers, and basically that is the most general definition of gamers and gaming as you can get. There's board games, there's role-playing games, there's video games talked about, and a whole range of subjects inside of that, including the sexism in these various gaming communities. Also a ton of queer comics. I was really happy about that. And so many different art styles, which is why I love picking up graphic novel anthologies. I thought they were just such high quality throughout. I don't think there was one story that I was like, I'm not really enjoying this. They were all amazing. For number 8, I have Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. This was originally an advice column called Dear Sugar. I was not expecting to read an advice column last year. I definitely wasn't expecting one to be one of my top reads of the year. The reason that I picked this up is this comes very highly recommended by a ton of people at Book Riot, people whose opinions I trust. So I thought I would give it a try. I listened to it as an audiobook and it was amazing. This is such a brutal book. She answers all these questions about really difficult things and meets them with the same kind of vulnerability. She really talks about her own life and the things that she's suffered and the things that she's done and mistakes she's made, and really opens up in an equal way to the people who are sharing these vulnerable things about themselves. It also is just so affecting. It really shows this world that we live in that is so incredibly difficult to live in sometimes, and also so beautiful and worth it. If you're looking for advice, if you're looking for somewhere to find hope, this is such an excellent book to pick up. And next I have yet another graphic novel, the only one that I actually own, and that's Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. I read this as part of the October 24-hour readathon because it's a little bit spooky, and I thought that this would be a really good pick as a quick thematic read. I loved it so much. I love the artwork. It's really vibrant, especially in person. The stories are creepy, very fairy tale-like, and just unsettling. It was perfect for an October readathon, but it's also one I want to return to just because I really love looking at the artwork. I feel like I could just pick a random page and want that framed on my wall. It's really beautiful. And there's kind of a theme of my 2016 reads of books that tell you how to survive in this world, because it was 2016 and a lot of those are going to be applicable in 2017, sadly. So one of the books that got recommended on Book Riot in dealing with Trump being elected was The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, which is a dystopian novel that was written in the early 90s. I've read a couple of Octavia Butler books before, and I know that they are excellently written and that they're always very thought-provoking. They're very cerebral reads for me. So I picked up Parable of the Sower, and it was eerily appropriate. It's set in the 2030s, so very near future now. It still seems very possible. It's post-climate change, the US falling apart economically and socially, and a very scary political presence. So definitely the dystopian aspect feels really, really appropriate, and I can see how this was recommended because it definitely addresses the fears that are happening right now, which is even scarier because it was written in the early 90s, and it just shows how much warning we've had and continue to march along on this path. It also has a really interesting plot. It's basically about the main character creating a religion. It kind of converted me to a fictional religion. It's a religion that just says God is change. And it just really seems like a good guideline for how to make choices. It was really weird to read about this religion and think like, yeah, I can get behind this. I feel like this makes total sense. So it definitely convinced me. So that was one of my favorite reads this year. I would definitely recommend this one, though it is not particularly reassuring. It is definitely appropriate. The other book that I picked up as a Book Riot recommendation for the election was The Impossible Will Take a Little While, edited by Rogat Loeb. This is about how to be hopeful in terrifying political times. It was written during the George W. Bush administration, but it does not seem dated at all. There are very few references that make you realize that this is not current, which again is terrible because it's really the same issues that are still around. This book is about how to have hope and how to think about hope. And if you are listening to that and thinking, how can you even talk about hope in this climate? Then this is exactly the right book for you, because it's not hope as this bright, happy, optimistic, everything's gonna be okay thing. It's defining hope as the thing that keeps you fighting. This isn't a fragile hope. This is hope regardless of the circumstance. There are just tons of excerpts and essays in this collection. Most of them are just a couple of pages long, so even though they're dealing with really big, heavy subjects, they are short enough that you never feel like you're getting completely bogged down. It's from a ton of different perspectives. There's a historical perspective. They talk about kind of big name activists, but they also talk about how important it is to do the kind of thankless everyday work that maybe history won't remember. It was a book that didn't say everything's going to be okay, that acknowledged that maybe it won't, and said, here's what to do anyway. If you're an activist, or if you want to be an activist, or if you're just wondering about how to have hope in a time that seems hopeless, definitely think about picking this book up, because it definitely will have at least some stories that you connect to, because it just covers such a broad range. It felt like the most nourishing book that I read this year. The next one is another graphic novel. I actually read it in webcomic form, but it's also out in book form, so I am counting it, and that is Strong Female Protagonist by Brennan Mulligan and illustrated by Ostertag. This is a comic about an ex-superhero. When she was a teenager, she was a superhero. She has super strength, then sort of retired from being a superhero because she felt like that was not the right thing to change the world. She felt like just punching people in the face wasn't enough, and that she wanted to go to school and educate herself about how to make a real difference in the world. Basically, this whole comic just deals with that question of how do you make things better and what is better. There was just a lot to think about in this comic. It was very philosophical. It's one that I would love to read with someone else because there's so much to discuss and so many big, interesting ideas that are touched upon. For number 3, I have Of Fire and Stars by Audrey Coulthurst. This is a young adult fantasy book that is about 2 princesses who fall in love. I just adored this book. It really scratched that Tamora Pierce itch. It has a lot of similarities, including a deep love for horses. There is like political court intrigue. The 2 main characters start off not really getting along, and then they grow to be friends, and then that grows into a romance. I just loved it. I don't even really know how to discuss it. It's like what I want Disney princess movies to be, which is a simplification because there's a lot more going on in this than like a Disney movie. But it was just really entertaining, and it is set in a world where being queer is not an issue even before the main character realizes that she's attracted to women. There are little asides about two men dancing together at the ball and that sort of thing, and it's not seen as a big deal. And it's just nice. It's really nice to read a book like that. This was just really fun and heartwarming, and I highly recommend it. My second favorite book of the year was 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. This is the same person who did the Encyclopedia of Early Earth, though I haven't read that one yet. And it is a retelling of 1001 Nights, and this is such a beautiful book. It's this really nice hardcover with like gilt lettering on the front, and it has the two women sort of reaching for each other's hands, so it's very obviously queer. And I love the artwork throughout. All of the page layouts are a little bit different. The storytelling style is amazing because it has all these little nesting stories that interact, and as much as I loved the main narrative, I was just as invested in all of the stories that she's telling. It also has this really great sense of humor that's very similar to Hark a Vagrant. It's super feminist. It also is talking about the power of stories and power of storytelling. It's really queer and unapologetically so. It was ridiculous. Like, from the first couple pages, I could not handle how much I loved it. It's like I needed to put it down and not read it because I was just so excited that it existed, because it's really clever and really beautifully done and also so unapologetically queer. And I was just like cracking up reading the jokes and wanting to just read it out to my partner because I thought all of it was so smart. It actually took me a little while to settle down enough to actually read it. Can't really recommend it any more than that. If I loved a book anymore, I physically would not be able to read it. And my number one book of the year is not one that I would say is perfect. I had some issues with it, but it was a life-changing book for me. And that book is Sexual Fluidity by Lisa Diamond. In case you don't know, for a good decade of my life, I identified as lesbian. And then a year ago, I fell in love with my roommate, who is a guy, and had a whole identity crisis, as you do. Before I picked up this book, I still didn't really feel like I had it figured out. So I have this list of books that I want to read. So this was one of the few times that I thought, hey, I'm actually going to read a book off this list. And I used a random number generator. Then after I'd kind of randomly gone through a couple of numbers, it settled on Sexual Fluidity. And I thought, there's probably no better time for me to read this book. And I read it, and it explained so much. And it was just so affirming to realize that I'm not alone and that it's actually not that uncommon. This book talks about all of the different aspects to desire and to how people experience attraction. Basically, it follows a group of women over, I believe, 10 years and talks about how their identities and attraction shift or don't over that time. What changed my life about reading this book was finding out that a good chunk of people who identify as lesbian go on to sleep with a man at some point in their life, or to date or fall in love with a man at some point in their life. It's not that unusual. It's not like the majority of lesbians or anything. Basically, it talks about how women experience desire and how that has a lot more capacity for fluidity than how the average man experiences desire. And this is my problem with the book, is that it is very cis-sexist and very binary. It just talks about men and women as these discrete categories. It doesn't really talk about the existence of trans people, even though some of the people in her study go on to identify as trans. She doesn't really seem to include the fact that trans people exist in this book at all. So she doesn't say, when she says women are like this, She doesn't say, and by women I mean people who have these hormone levels, or people who have these chromosomes, or people who have a uterus. Like, she doesn't talk about what she actually means by that. She argues that, especially for women, there are a lot of different components to sexual desire, and that whereas the average man experiences more spontaneous sexual desire that is internal and biological, that the average woman is much more responsive to her environment in terms of desire. There is sexual orientation, which is the biological response that you have to different sexes or genders. So my sexual orientation is primarily towards women, but that there's also the component of the degree of fluidity that you have. So different people are more or less responsive to changes in their environment. If you're in an environment that is mostly of the same gender as you, then you might experience your desire differently than if you're in an environment that is a mix of genders or that is primarily another gender from you. There's also the capacity for person-based attraction, which really hit home for me. And basically it's talking about whether becoming emotionally intimate with someone can then lead to romantic feelings, which can then lead to sexual feelings, regardless of who you're usually attracted to. And once I read this book, I realized that it exactly explained what happened to me, that I experienced sexual fluidity because of this person-based attraction. I have an even longer review at the Lesbury if you want to hear all my thoughts about that book. It really was very, very reassuring. Even if you haven't experienced sexual fluidity, I would recommend reading this just to understand how other people experience desire and to understand that sexual and romantic attraction and identities are much more complex than we usually discuss them as. But especially if you have experienced sexual fluidity, if you feel like you don't really fit into the general categories of sexual orientation, I highly recommend reading this book, with the caveat that it is not good with trans issues. And yeah, those were my top 10 favorite books of 2016, and thank you for watching.